Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at Adaptation and Natural Selection by George Williams. And this book was published originally in 1966. It's a pretty well-known book by a pretty well-known author in the world of evolutionary theory and evolutionary psychology. And this book, the main claim to fame of this book, and really the main thesis of this book, is the dismantling or attempted dismantling of the concept of group selection. This is the idea that there are different groups of creatures, such as flocks of birds or schools of fish or what have you, and they compete against other groups. It could also be viewed in the sense of a species competing against other species. And for a long time, group selection was a very unpopular concept, largely because of this book. It has since got a bit of a rehabilitation in some later books, largely from the 90s. I'm going to get to those books as well down the road. I think there is such a thing as group selection, although I'm not sure how powerful it is. He makes a pretty good case here that it's... He actually seems to indicate that it's real, but it's very weak. And it's hypothetically possible, at least that's the impression I get from this, is that it's hypothetically possible, but it's such a weak phenomena compared to individual selection, people competing against other people or animals competing against other animals for resources and for procreative opportunity. That is such a powerful force in evolution that groups competing against other groups is negligible. And most of the things, well, really all of the things, he seems to say, that people often point to and say, that's group selection. He says, no, actually, that's individual selection. It just looks like group selection. This could be stated as the difference between a herd of fast deer and a fast herd of deer. It might seem like it's a semantic difference, but it's not really. The herd doesn't have the quality of swiftness. The individual deer have the quality of swiftness, and that gives that quality to the herd. And this is kind of like just the premise that where the adaptation exists is in the individuals. The individuals have the adaptations, and the group can appear to have its own qualities, but the group doesn't really have qualities. The individuals have those qualities. And so it's sort of an ongoing discussion in evolutionary theory. For a long time, group selection was sort of taboo on account of this book. And like I said, it's been rehabilitated a little bit, and I'll get into that further on, but I just want to lay the foundation for this topic here. I think when we get into the subject of like human societies and whether people are tribal by nature, and whether different groups of people have different biological qualities to them and how they got them and things like that, it's at least a worthwhile question to consider just how much of a factor group selection really is. It can help us understand why human groups behave the way they do and what human groups really mean, what kind of traits we have as groups, and how bound we are to the traits of the group and things like that. It can help us understand human behavior, I think, when we sort of pin down the parameters within which we're devising our various evolutionary theories for explaining human behavior. So anyway, one of the first things he talks about is the difference between an adaptation and a secondary function or a secondary benefit of an adaptation. And so this is, I think, pretty interesting. This is from the introduction, and this kind of ties back to the group selection, because if individuals have certain qualities, it may be that the secondary effects of the adaptations of the individuals can look like they are group adaptations, but they're not adaptations at all. They're just side effects of individual adaptations. That's kind of why he introduces this in the introduction. So here he says, quote, "A frequent practice is to recognize adaptation in any recognizable benefit arising from the activities of an organism. I believe that this is an insufficient basis for postulating adaptation and that it has led to some serious errors. A benefit can be the result of chance instead of design. The decision as to the purpose of a mechanism must be based on an examination of the machinery and an argument as to the appropriateness of the means to the end. It cannot be based on value judgments of actual or probable consequences. This can also be illustrated with an example that will probably not be controversial. Consider a fox on its way to the henhouse for the first time after a heavy snowfall. It will probably encounter considerable difficulty in forcing its way through the obstructing material. On subsequent trips, however, it may follow the same path and have a much easier time of it because of the furrow it made the first time. The formation of a path through the snow may result in considerable saving of time and food energy for the fox, and such savings may be crucial for survival. Should we therefore regard the pause of a fox as a mechanism for constructing paths through the snow? Clearly we should not. It is better, perhaps, because it avoids the onerous biological principles of adaptation and natural selection to regard the trailblazing as an incidental effect of the locomotor machinery, no matter how beneficial it may be. An examination of the legs and feet of the fox forces the conclusion that they are designed for running and walking, not for the packing or removal of snow. At any rate, the concept of design for snow removal would not explain anything in the fox's appendages that is not as well or better explained by design for locomotion. Although the construction of a path through the snow should not be considered a function of the activities that have this effect, the fox does adaptively exploit the effect by seeking the same path on successive trips to the henhouse. The sensory mechanisms by which it perceives the most familiar and least obstructed routes, and the motivation to follow the path of least effort, are clearly adaptations. Sometimes the important effect of an adaptation from man's point of view may not be its function. Biologically, the brewing of beer is not the function of the glycolytic enzymes of yeast. The production of guano is an important effect for man's agricultural interests, of the digestive mechanisms of a number of species of marine birds, but this effect is not their function. Many non-biologists think that it is for their benefit that rattles grow on rattlesnake tails." End quote. Okay, so not a super long section there, but he introduces this idea of a fox on its way to the henhouse making a pathway through the snow. And basically he says, look, the legs and the feet of the fox operate for one purpose, and that is to propel the fox forward. It's his means of movement. The fox moves because it has legs and feet, right? Clearly. The legs and feet of a fox don't exist for the purpose of making a pathway through the snow. It's an incidental effect. Now the fox exploits the path it has made. On subsequent trips, it can see the path, and it takes the path, and it benefits from this effect that it had on the snow. But its legs, its movement, its body is not crafted for the purpose of packing snow. Now, I'm not a biologist. I'm not an evolutionary theorist. But I can't help but wonder whether there might be something somehow to the shape of a fox that may actually be involved in adaptation and selection in this regard. I think he maybe have spoken a little too soon. Obviously, the legs and feet of a fox are primarily for locomotion. But you notice that prey animals have a different shape. They have long, skinny legs. Like deer. Deer don't really make a path in the snow, I don't think, in the same way that a fox does. They'll make a path, but it'll be largely hoof prints. And they have narrow, skinny legs, and they lift them up. So the shape of the legs of a fox, the shape of the legs of a deer, all are going to have different impacts on the snow. And it may be the case that the form of the fox, the shape of the fox, the low body of the fox, the gait of the fox do in fact have some adaptation designed for creating a pathway in the snow. I'm not saying they do. I don't know. But I wonder if there's more to it. So my point is that there's a primary adaptation, purpose, and function of the legs of the fox, and that's for locomotion. But not all legs are the same, and it may be that the legs are also involved in a secondary adaptation process. So they evolve first for locomotion, but they also have a certain form, have a certain quality that facilitates the creation of furrows in the snow. Maybe so, right? And that's kind of like there's multiple levels of adaptation. There's the primary adaptation, and then there's the secondary adaptation. And it may not be that the primary adaptation is thus, and the secondary adaptation is always or primarily just a coincidental side effect. I don't think you should look at things as coincidental side effects. That's not to say that there's no coincidences and there's no side effects, but I feel like every aspect of an evolved creature, every aspect of an evolved creature's behavior as well, has been through the gauntlet of selection. The shape of the fox's legs are a certain way and not a different certain way because of other things. Like, say, maybe the shape of predators tend to not have hooves. Prey animals tend to have hooves. The legs are different, right? Because they operate a little bit differently. The predator's concerned with being quiet, and the prey is concerned more so with being fleet, with being fast. And maybe the hooves are enable it to move faster. I don't know. But you will notice, I think, that most prey animals have hooves and most predators have paws. So, do with that what you will. Anyway, let's move on to the next section when he starts talking about group selection specifically, where he says, quote, "It is essential that the reader firmly grasp the general meaning of biotic adaptation. He must be able to make a conceptual distinction between a population of adapted insects and an adapted population of insects. The fact that an insect population survives through a succession of generations is not evidence for the existence of biotic adaptation. The survival of the population may be merely an incidental consequence of the organic adaptations by which each insect attempts to survive and reproduce itself. The survival of the population depends on these individual efforts. To determine whether this survival is the proper function or merely an incidental byproduct of the individual effort must be decided by a critical examination of the reproductive processes. We must decide, do these processes show an effective design for maximizing the number of descendants of the individual, or do they show an effective design for maximizing the number, rate of growth, or numerical stability of the population or larger system? Any feature of the system that promotes group survival and cannot be explained as an organic adaptation can be called a biotic adaptation. If the population has such adaptations, it can be called an adapted population. If it does not, if its continued survival is merely incidental to the operation of organic adaptations, it is merely a population of adapted insects. Like the theory of genic selection, the theory of group selection is logically a tautology, and there can be no sane doubt about the reality of the process. Rational criticism must center on the importance of the process, and on its adequacy in explaining the phenomena attributed to it. An important tenet of evolutionary theory is that natural selection can produce significant cumulative change only if selection coefficients are high relative to the rates of change of the selected entity. Since genic selection coefficients are high relative to mutation rates, it is logically possible for the natural selection of alternative alleles to have important cumulative effects. It was pointed out earlier that there can be no effective selection of somata. They have limited lifespans and often zero biotic potential. The same considerations apply to populations of somata. I also pointed out that genotypes have limited lives and fail to reproduce themselves. They are destroyed by meiosis and recombination, except where clonal reproduction is possible. This is equally true of populations of genotypes. All of the genotypes of fruit fly populations now living will have ceased to exist in a few weeks. Within a population, only the gene is stable enough to be effectively selected. Likewise, in selection among populations, only populations of genes, gene pools, seem to qualify with respect to the necessary stability. Even gene pools will not always qualify. If populations are evolving rapidly and have a low rate of extinction and replacement, the rate of endogenous change might be too great for group selection to have any cumulative effect. This argument precisely parallels that which indicates that mutation rates must be low relative to selection coefficients for genic selection to be effective. If a group of adequately stable populations is available, group selection can theoretically produce biotic adaptations, for the same reason that genic selection can produce organic adaptations. Consider the evolution of size among tertiary horses. Suppose that at one time there was a genus of 2 species, one that averaged 100 kilograms when full grown, and another that averaged 150 kilograms. Assume that genic selection in both species favored a smaller size, so that 1,000,000 years later the larger of the two averaged only 130 kilograms, and the smaller had become extinct but had lost 20 kilograms before it did. In this case, we could say that the genus evolved an increased size, even though both of the included species evolved a decreased size. If the extinction of the smaller species is not just a chance event, but is attributable to its smaller size, we might refer to large size as a biotic adaptation of a simple sort. However, it is the origin of complex adaptations, for which the concept of functional design would be applicable, that is the important consideration. End quote. Okay, so there's a few terms introduced here that I want to step back and define. First of all, he talks about biotic adaptation. He also talks about genic adaptation. Biotic adaptation is essentially the group adaptation. The group adaptation is the adaptation of a population of creatures. Then he talks about organic adaptations, which is essentially organisms, the adaptation of organisms as opposed to groups. And here he does mention the sort of group of insects or an adapted population of insects or a population of adapted insects. And he says you can kind of see, you can discover by the reproductive processes. He says to determine whether the survival of this group is the proper function or merely an incidental byproduct of the individual efforts, this can be decided by the study of the reproductive process. Is the reproductive process in maximizing the survival of the genes of an individual insect, or is the reproductive process producing results, numbers, types that support first and foremost the survival of the group of insects? I don't know if reproduction is really the only place where you're going to find your answers to these questions, but it seems like a pretty good place to start. I mean, so much of evolution really comes down to reproductive success. But he does say it's possible. He says, like the theory of genic selection, which is the selection of genes competing against other genes, which is really at the core of evolution. He says the theory of group selection is logically a tautology, and there can be no sane doubt about the reality of the process. So he is saying that group selection exists. It must exist in some form, right? It's just by the definition of how natural selection works, group selection must be a thing. But the real question is, how powerful is it? How much of a factor is it? He says rational criticism must center on the importance of the process and on its adequacy in explaining the phenomena that are attributed to it. So does group selection really work as a theory to explain the various qualities that we see in groups? Now, he says there's no effective selection of somata, by which he means forms, the form of a creature. Because creatures die, right? You're not going to be selected for replication. You're not going to live over the long term while some other person dies. Everybody dies. Every creature dies. No creature passes itself on, right? No creature lives over the long term. Creatures aren't really being selected for and against. Genes, and specifically the code of genes, the sequence, not the actual matter, not the actual material of the gene, right? Obviously that decays, but the sequence, the code. The code is what is being selected. The code is what lasts over time. It's what endures. And honestly, he says genotypes are the same as somata. In other words, your complete genetic code, the set of chromosomes, the whole picture of your DNA is not going to be selected for or against as a whole because it doesn't replicate itself. Your children are not your clones. He says this sort of genotype selection only happens in the case of clones. He says if you look at the fruit flies that exist today, the genetic code specific to each fruit fly will no longer exist in a week. They'll all be gone. The individual sections, little snippets of gene code can get passed on. They can survive. But the entirety of the genetic code of a single fruit fly is gone when that fruit fly dies, because fruit flies have sexual reproduction and they have sperm and eggs just like animals. And so the specific genotype of any individual fruit fly does not endure. It's only the allele, which is a set of genes, a cluster of genes. My understanding of an allele is essentially a cluster of genes. However, interestingly, he says there's actually something else that endures over time. Although my genetic code, as constituted in me, does not endure beyond my death, only little snippets of genes endure, the gene pool endures, by which he means the set of genes that comprise a larger group. What he says specifically is, when he says all the genotypes of fruit fly populations now living will have ceased to exist in a few weeks, he says within a population only the gene is stable enough to be effectively selected. But he says likewise in selection among populations, only populations of genes or gene pools seem to qualify with respect to the necessary stability. So in a group of creatures that mates within the group, let's look at it from the perspective of humans, because this is something that we can understand, and it's the sort of thing I've talked about before. Let's look at Iceland and Japan. Iceland is an island, and so is Japan, and so these are sort of easy to visualize as isolated communities. Over time, over many years, over many generations, there's a lot of intermingling, and there comes about a gene pool of Icelandic people and a gene pool of Japanese people, such that anybody born in Iceland will resemble somebody else born elsewhere in Iceland more so than they would resemble somebody born in Japan. Doesn't matter which two people you pick from Iceland and which two people you pick from Japan to do the procreation, the child will look Icelandic for the Icelandic parents, and it will look Japanese for the Japanese parents, because each island has its own gene pool with its own qualities. So this is the idea that the genes within a population are similar enough, right? The people carry a set. The people in the population, the entities, the animals within a population carry a set of genes. They're drawing on a set of genes, and that they're drawing from the gene pool. The group as a whole has a gene pool, and over time, the gene pool endures, right? Over centuries, The Icelandic people remain essentially Icelandic, and the Japanese people remain essentially Japanese. The gene pool endures over time. The collection of genes endures over time. So I thought that was interesting. He says, like, the gene endures and the gene pool endures. The genotype does not endure. The phenotype does not endure, right? Your physical characteristics does not endure. The somata, the actual body, does not endure. The gene and the gene pool are what endure. I thought that was very interesting. But the last thing he talks about are a couple of horses, a couple of species of horses, and I think this is an interesting example where there are two species of horses in, long ago, and they're of different sizes. And he says, imagine that over time, selection pressures on the individual horses within each species are causing it to get smaller. Over time, the species get smaller and smaller and smaller. However, the smaller of the two species goes extinct. And the larger of the species hasn't shrunk down all that much. You've got, say, one of them is about 100 kilograms. The other species is about 150 kilograms. Now, if we imagine hypothetically that there are just as many of one species as the other to start with, then the average size of the member of the genus is 125 kilograms. Then they each lose 20 kilograms of size, but the smaller one goes extinct. So the remaining one is an average of 130. So the genus has gotten larger, even though each of the species within the genus has gotten smaller. The smallest of them was eliminated. So the genus gets bigger while the species gets smaller. And I just thought that was an interesting exercise here. And this goes to show that, in a sense, he does talk about species as groups. And so there's a couple different levels of group here, obviously. There's the person as a group of genes, which is its own sort of type of group. But then there's the family as a type of group, and the similarity between the members of the family operate in such an obviously sort of selfish gene way, like you help your offspring, you feed your offspring because they share copies of your genetic code. So you're like, if you consider a mother and a child as a quote-unquote group, the mother's feeding the child not because she wants the group to do well, but because she wants the child to do well, and she wants the child to do well because it carries her genes. This is the selfish gene. This is the gene serving its own interests, as that gene is manifested in an entity other than the mother. Same thing with close kin. And then you've got larger groups, like ethnic groups, and then you've got larger groups where you might say that the relatedness of the various individuals is small enough that it stops being a concern. And then you've got larger groups where you could say species are competing against other species. If a species goes extinct, you could say that species wasn't fit, the other species was the fit species. And that's the kind of language that you would use when you're talking about species competing with species, which is a type of group selection. Anyway, let's keep moving. He begins to talk a bit about sexual reproduction, where he says, quote, biologists very commonly regard sexual reproduction as a biotic adaptation. This is implied in the frequent recognition of sexuality as having the function of providing evolutionary plasticity. The variety of genotypes produced by sexual reproduction presumably provides the species with at least some individuals that can successfully survive any change that is likely to take place. It is difficult to evaluate the extremity of some of the points of view that have been expressed. It sometimes seems as if natural selection itself were regarded as an adaptive mechanism whereby species avoid extinction or exploit the possibilities of adaptive radiation. If provision for geologically future contingencies is considered an evolved adaptation, certainly some sort of teleological thinking is suggested. Such thinking is not necessarily implied by an author who expresses the belief that sexuality decreases the likelihood of extinction. only if he believes that the need to avoid extinction is a cause of the development or retention of sexuality would his thinking probably be teleological. Even here, he might avoid the stigma by some reference to group selection as a force for the development of evolutionary plasticity. Occasionally, however, teleological reasoning is unmistakable. Darlington, for instance, speaks of the evolutionary factor of anticipation and uses the origin of meiosis and of sexual reproduction as examples. He concludes that the evolutionary force of natural selection acting on the genetic system is endowed with an unparalleled gift, an automatic property of foresight. He bases his argument on the assumption that it is impossible to imagine sexual reproduction as the result of a gradual accumulation of changes, each one of which had value as an adaptation. This is a surprising statement because Boyden and Doherty had already published carefully reasoned theories based on precisely this impossible assumption. Indeed, Boyden argued that meiosis and syngamy were evolved gradually, with each stage being useful to its possessor, not once but several times independently in unrelated lines of descent. Huxley concurred in Darlington's recognition of an anticipatory factor in evolution. He maintained that outcrossing in sexual reproduction represents an immediate sacrifice in precision of adaptation, but is maintained because the resulting variability allows the population to meet possible future needs. According to Huxley, adaptation must be a dual concept and must include mechanisms for long-term population survival as well as immediate success. End quote. So what was that all about? What he's talking about is sexual reproduction as a feature. And by sexual reproduction, what we're really getting at is the combination of the sperm and the egg, right? I mean, this is really how sexual work. You don't clone yourself. You don't sprout a baby and shed off babies. You don't clone babies. Babies are created through sexual reproduction, meaning the sperm carries half of a full set of chromosomes. Every cell in your body has a full set of DNA, right? Except for your sperm or your eggs. Those have half. It's not a full set. It's only half. And when the sperm and the egg combine, those two halves are joined, and now you have a child with a full set of chromosomes, the full suite of DNA, the full batch of genes, the whole 9 yards. The process by which you give up half of your genes, which are selected in part at random, and the other person half of their genes, which are partly selected at random, mostly I think, but I don't know the exact details of that. But at any rate, each person is giving up 50% of their DNA so that your offspring are 50% related to you and 50% related to the other parent. Now, this has a couple of consequences. One of them is that your genetic code does not persevere over the long term as well as it would if you had offspring that shared all of your genes. There's always the chance that you're going to lose some of your genetic code. It's not going to come through. If you only have one child, 50% of your genetic code doesn't get passed on. Only the other 50% does. That's an important point. And there's a recombination, so you get more. There's more chaos, right? You have 5 clones. They're all exactly the same, but you have 5 kids reproduced sexually, and each one of them is different because they've gotten a different set from you and a different set from the other parent. So you've got 5 different kids as opposed to 5 clones. So let's say an ice age is around the corner, and there's a series of very cold winters, and one of your kids has whatever genetic qualities it would be. Maybe they're hairy. I don't know. Maybe they've got a lot of body fat. One of your kids has just what it takes to survive. This kind of mixing up of the genes can create can create offspring of a variety of types, where some of them are going to be genetic dead ends. They're going to be losers. They're going to get your worst half and your spouse's worst half, and they're going to be not much. But then another one might get your best half and your spouse's best half, and they might be really great offspring. There's variety here in order to respond to changing circumstances. Now, an argument is made by some that sexual reproduction is a phenomena that exists in order to provide the species with variety, so that the species can live out over the long term. So moving on along this somewhat similar line of thinking, he says, quote, "The belief that genetic recombination is mainly related to future needs is still prevalent. The best recent work of this sort is that of Stebbins, who attempted a general synthesis based on the assumption that phylogenetic variation in sexual processes in higher plants can be related to phylogenetic variation in the need for evolutionary plasticity. I am not entirely clear from Stebbins' discussion just how long a term is involved in this capacity of genetic plasticity, but it does seem that he has biotic adaptation in mind. I would find his reasoning entirely acceptable if it were applied to individuals rather than to populations. The reasons that he adduces for certain populations requiring genetic plasticity more than others apply equally well to the individuals in these populations. For instance, the associations that he recognizes between rates of recombination and such factors as environmental stability and rate of turnover of generations are equally significant at both levels. If successive generations are likely to grow up in very similar environments, a precise adaptation to the prevailing conditions, once achieved, had better be maintained. Such adaptation may be largely dependent on an unstable system of heterosis at many loci. Under these circumstances, a suppression of recombination will be favorable to population survival. However, when the conditions faced by one generation are a poor indication of what the next will face, the best strategy will be to produce a new generation with diverse kinds of competence, so that at least some will be adapted to whatever conditions are actually met. In this case, the best thing for the population is to maximize recombination, so as to produce a wide variety of genotypes. The same arguments are valid for an individual plant. The individual, having succeeded in attaining maturity in a particular environment, is probably of above average genotypic fitness for that environment. If it is to produce offspring that are likely to grow up under the same conditions, it would do well to make them as much like itself as possible. On the other hand, if its own conditions of life are unreliable, as an indication of the conditions its offspring will face, it would be better to utilize recombination to broaden the total competence of the group of offspring produced. Whenever such arguments work as well at one level as at another, the acceptance of one level and rejection of the other might seem a matter of taste and of little consequence. It is in precisely such a situation, however, that Occam's razor must be used. The principle of adaptation must be recognized at no higher level of organization than is absolutely necessary. If a phenomenon can be explained as an organic adaptation, it is not permissible to explain it as a biotic adaptation. End quote. So that's, there's some technical jargon scattered here and throughout this book that can make it a little bit challenging if you're not a professional evolutionary theorist, but he's talking about genetic plasticity, and he's talking about whether this genetic plasticity benefits the population or the individual. And essentially, he says that this is a sort of forward-facing, like it's thinking about the next generation or future generations. And if you think about it from a species perspective, you might think, well, the species has this recombination through sexual reproduction to create a multitude of types of plants, kind of more genetic randomness, more genetic recombinations in order to survive over the long term, with no real pinpoint on what that long term is. But he says you could say the exact same thing about an individual plant. There's two kind of scenarios that he lays out, and this might even apply not just to sexual recombination, but also to mutation. It's possible that mutation rates could vary. There might be some mechanisms in the DNA that cause the genetic code to be more stable, or cause the genetic code to be less stable, more prone to mutation. I don't know the details of how those mechanisms would work, but the thing he's really talking about is the recombination that happens as a result of sexual selection, not just mutation per se, on the DNA level, like mutation via radiation of the particular details of a genetic code. But he's talking about the recombination in sexual reproduction, and essentially he's saying that if the environment is very stable and a creature has evolved to fit that environment, and the expectation is that the environment will be the same tomorrow as it is today, if it will be the same in the future as it is today, then the best thing that a creature can do would be to create offspring that are as similar to it as possible in order to benefit from whatever fitness the parent individual, the parent organism has acquired. Those fit genes the parent would want to pass on to its offspring. Whereas if the future is unstable, if the future, like I said, of a potential ice age or whatever it may be, if it's a creature that wanders and doesn't stay in one place, it may wind up in many different places. Then that would be a scenario whereby the future is more unpredictable, and so the variety is necessary. But the point is that this author that he's referring to here, Stebbins, is trying to tie it back to population groups. That this randomness of recombination is of benefit to the population group. And the author here says this. He says, I would find his reasoning entirely acceptable if it were applied to individuals rather than to populations. And this is kind of obvious to me, but he's totally correct that if the population group has an unstable future, then the individual has an unstable future, and the individual would benefit from the variety of offspring just as much as the population group would. And he says that if you're given a choice between, this is an adaptation that benefits the group, or this is an adaptation that benefits the individual within the group, he says, refer back to Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is the correct explanation. And he's really saying the complexity of the selective entity should be minimized. And I think what he's really saying is it should be as close as possible to the actual unit of replication, which is the gene. And so an individual is like one step removed from the genetic code, and the group is several steps removed from the genetic code, right? A group doesn't have a genotype. An individual has a genotype, and the group has a collection of genotypes, which constitute a sort of gene pool, as I said. But it's not as direct. It's not as directly connected to the genes as the individual. So moving along a little bit, he talks more about the stability of the genetic code. And he says, quote, another aspect of the reproductive fitness of genes is their stability. Their fitness can only be measured by success in replication. If the individual that bears them dies before reproducing, the genes have failed to reproduce. The production of an A by a B is just as much a failure for B, or more so. It directly adds to the frequency of a competing allele. The fittest possible degree of stability is absolute stability. In other words, natural selection of mutation rates has only one possible direction, that of reducing the frequency of mutation to zero. That mutations should continue to occur after billions of years of adverse selection requires no special explanation. It is merely a reflection of the unquestionable principle that natural selection can often produce mechanisms of extreme precision, but never of perfection. It is not so much that mutations occur that requires the attention of biologists, but that they occur so rarely. Where else in nature can we find complex biochemically active molecules that can persist unchanged for centuries or millennia in aqueous systems at terrestrial temperatures? Not only do they persist, they duplicate themselves with great precision. Surely these features can be interpreted only by postulating a long period of relentless selection for stability. One frequently hears that natural selection will not produce too low a mutation rate because that would reduce the evolutionary plasticity of the species. It has been argued above that evolutionary plasticity is not an adaptation that can be produced by natural selection. Evolution has probably reduced mutation rates to far below species optima, as the result of unrelenting selection for zero mutation rate in every population. Mutation is, of course, a necessary precondition to continued evolutionary change. So, evolution takes place not so much because of natural selection, but to a large degree in spite of it. The phenomena associated with genetic influences on mutation rates are important evidence. There are known instances of mutator genes that can be attributed to specific loci and have the effect of greatly increasing mutation rates at other loci. These genes are always detected and measured by comparison with normal mutation rates, and it would appear that genes that permit high mutation rates in a species are rare in natural populations. This rarity argues for their adverse selection under normal conditions. It also indicates that the rest of the genotype is adjusted to the normal alleles at the mutator loci. Any change to the genetic environment of a gene, for instance, by integration into another species, or even by a shift from outbreeding to inbreeding or vice versa, can be expected to increase the mutation rate of a gene. That mutation rate is at its minimum in the normal genetic environment can only be explained on the assumption of selection for this minimization in that environment. End quote. Okay, so what is that? That is, he's talking about mutation, the mutation of genes, and he makes a couple interesting points. He says one aspect of the reproductive fitness of genes is their stability. And he says, look, the genetic codes are very stable over time. Like we share a huge amount of genetic code with our closest neighbor, the chimpanzee. It's 90 plus, 98 something. Not it's high. It's well over 90% of our genetic code that we share with chimpanzees. We've diverged from chimpanzees a long, long time ago, and yet we still share a lot of genetic code. The point here is that the genetic code is very stable. Yes, it mutates, but it doesn't really mutate all that much. And he says that the fitness of a gene is measured by its capacity to replicate itself, right? To the capacity to make copies of itself. So if you have gene A that creates another gene, it replicates itself, and the output is gene B, in other words, it's not the same, it's not A. A creates B by mutation rather than creating another A. You now have a competitor. You now have a new gene, B, that is in competition with A. If A creates B, B creates C, C creates D, it keeps mutating each generation, but then in version D, it locks into some sort of mechanism that makes it more stable. Then D produces D, and then D produces D, and it keeps producing gene D, because it stops mutating. Then what you have is that the stable gene is selected for. The unstable genes that kept changing and changing. And then when it hit stability, it locked in. And so the stability is the fitness. That's where it settles in, and that's where it stays. So evolution depends on mutation. And here's the interesting point, I think, is that natural selection selects for stability. Natural selection almost operates against evolution. Evolution happens in spite of natural selection. Natural selection is aiming at genetic stability so that the genes keep reproducing exact copies of themselves. But evolution happens because the natural selection can't entirely get rid of the various reasons for mutation. So I thought that was an interesting concept. So what we have is a sort of combination of the mutation rates aiming at minimal mutation, but the recombination is different than mutation. The recombination happens at the kind of chromosomal level. The individual gene isn't, recombined so much as the chromosomes are. So there's two factors happening here, and it's just really interesting how they relate to one another. And he also, interestingly, he says that there are some genes that they're called mutator genes, and they cause mutations at other locations. They don't mutate themselves, but they prompt mutations in other parts of the chromosome, other parts of the DNA, which I thought that was pretty interesting, but those are not particularly common. They almost seem to be selected against. I don't know, that whole area of study is pretty interesting. Anyway, I want to keep moving here to one thing that, this is jumping forward a bit in the book. He talks a little bit about the difference between males and females. The good old topic of conversation. I've been getting into arguments with people on Twitter, X, about this topic. It's really important that we understand this, though. So much of our society has to do with the relationship between men and women. And if we don't understand the evolutionary theory that explains the differences between men and women, we're going to keep getting this wrong. We're going to keep not understanding women. We're going to keep not understanding men. We're not going to understand the conflicts between them, the coordinations between them, the ways in which this difference affects our civilization. You cannot go wrong by understanding this stuff. So, he says, quote, "The optimization of effort, combined with the different primary roles of the sexes, may explain the different secondary roles of the sexes. It is commonly observed that males show a greater readiness for reproduction than females. This is understandable as a consequence of the greater physiological sacrifice made by females for the production of each surviving offspring. A male mammal's essential role may end with copulation, which involves a negligible expenditure of energy and materials on his part, and only a momentary lapse of attention from matters of direct concern to his safety and well-being. The situation is markedly different for the female, for which copulation may mean a commitment to a prolonged burden in both the mechanical and physiological sense, and its many attendant stresses and dangers. Consequently, the male, having little to lose in his primary reproductive role, shows an aggressive and immediate willingness to mate with as many females as may be available. If he undertakes his reproductive role and fails, he has lost very little. If he succeeds, he can be just as successful for a very minor effort as a female could be only after a major somatic sacrifice. Failure for a female mammal may mean weeks or months of wasted time. The mechanical and nutritional burden of pregnancy may mean increased vulnerability to predators, decreased disease resistance, and other dangers for a long time. Even if she successfully endures these stresses and hazards, she can still fail completely if her litter is lost before weaning. Once she starts on her reproductive role, she commits herself to a certain high minimum of reproductive effort. Natural selection should regulate her reproductive behavior in such a way that she will assume the burdens of reproduction only when the probability of success is at some peak value that is not likely to be exceeded. The traditional coyness of the female is thus easily attributed to adaptive mechanisms, by which she can discriminate the ideal moment and circumstances for assuming the burdens of motherhood. One of the most important circumstances is the inseminating male. It is to the female's advantage to be able to pick the most fit male available for fathering her brood. Unusually fit fathers tend to have unusually fit offspring. One of the functions of courtship would be the advertisement by a male of how fit he is. A male whose general health and nutrition enables him to indulge in full development of secondary sexual characteristics, especially courtship behavior, is likely to be reasonably fit genetically. Other important signs of fitness would be the ability to occupy a choice nesting site, and a large territory, and the power to defeat or intimidate other males. In submitting only to a male with such signs of fitness, a female would probably be aiding the survival of her own genes. Inevitably, there is a kind of evolutionary battle of the sexes. If a male attempts to reproduce at all in a certain breeding season, it is to his advantage to pretend to be highly fit, whether he is or not. If a weak and unresourceful male successfully coaxes a female to mate with him, he has lost nothing, and he may have successfully reproduced. It will be to the female's advantage, however, to be able to tell the males that are really fit from those that merely pretend to be. In such a population, genic selection will foster a skilled salesmanship among the males and an equally well-developed sales resistance and discrimination among the females. This evolutionary effect of female choice has been formally analyzed by O'Donnell. The original idea, like so many other important insights, was contributed by R.A. Fisher. The greater promiscuity of the male and greater caution and discrimination of the female is found in animals generally. Even without such specific female functions as pregnancy and lactation, it is almost always true that females contribute the greater amount of material and food energy to the next generation. A female can readily increase her reproductive effort merely by increasing the mass of gametes, to the point at which further gain would not be worth the sacrifice. For males, especially in species with internal fertilization with its great economy of sperm, the problem is not so simple. A male can easily produce sperm in excess of what it would take to fertilize all the females that could conceivably be available. The reproductive effort involved in male gametogenesis would ordinarily be slight. Most of his reproductive effort can be devoted to the problem of increasing the number of females available for insemination. Hence, the development of the masculine emphasis on courtship and territoriality or other forms of conflict with competing males. End quote. So here is just like the basics of the scenario. And it's very straightforward. And people, when you try to take these concepts and apply them to humans, people are very resistant. They think that that doesn't make sense. It's not true. In some circumstances, they will accept that, okay, that's true for animals, but as humans, we are able to transcend these kind of constraints. We have free will, we have decision-making, we can chart our own path, and we don't have to be like this if we don't want to. I think they overestimate how easy it is to step out of the evolutionary process, and moreover, how easy it is to step out of our instincts, to say that our instincts are optional. Our instincts really are not optional. And you can refer back to some of my discussions of William James's books to see more about the necessity of instincts. But the premise is pretty straightforward. The male has a drastically reduced expenditure of effort and resources in this process. And in the animal kingdom, and that's where we evolved, and that's where we got a lot of our traits. We're not exactly, we don't exactly behave like wild animals, but we share a lot of the traits of wild animals that we've carried with us into our humanity. And especially when you consider that the circumstances described here haven't changed. We may no longer be battling off saber-toothed tigers. We may no longer be dying of rampant disease like we used to be. But the fact remains that women, in almost all circumstances, have to carry a child to term within their uterus. And the only alternative is if it's carried to term in someone else's uterus. The woman, the female, has a great investment in time and in effort in the reproductive process, much more than a male does. Now, things change on account of technology, but our behaviors don't entirely change. And female choosiness, right? Women are like gatekeepers. This is an unpopular phrase, an unpopular concept. But he says here that the females are less promiscuous. The males tend to be more promiscuous, and in the animal kingdom, females more hesitant, more skeptical. They're judging the males. They're trying to select the best male because they're such an investment. They want to make sure they get it right. They want to make sure their offspring are going to survive. So they're not going to be able to have 100 offspring. They're only going to be able to have a few. And, especially in the animal kingdom, they run the risk of dying from some complication in pregnancy. And they want to make sure they get it right. Now, in the modern world, we have abortions, and we have birth controls, and we have other means by which the female doesn't have to be as selective in who she has sex with, because the sex doesn't have to result in a pregnancy. But you'll find the very same selectiveness when it comes to who she will procreate with, who she'll have children with. She might sleep with somebody she just met, but she doesn't really want to have children with somebody she just met. She wants to evaluate him a little bit more. Now, it may be that he has impressed her, but in such a way that she wants to have his children, even though they just met. But in that case, he has impressed her with his genetic viability, with the superiority of his genes. Then she'll say, okay, I'll bear his children. There remains a choosiness in women. They don't just get pregnant and have anybody's children. There's still a choosiness in who they procreate with, whose children they're willing to have. And that's part of their kind of gatekeeper role. And the males have a surplus of sexual energy and sexual drive. A male benefits by inseminating a large number of females. Men are after quantity more so than quality. They're going to be reproductively successful by inseminating large numbers of females. The female is going to be reproductively successful by ensuring that she's only impregnated by high-quality males. Obviously, men are looking for high-quality females as well, but it's not the same. It's not to the same degree. They're not as picky. And this is how the animal kingdom is, and we inherit this from the animal kingdom. People don't like to admit it, but this is who we are. This is who we are. This is how we are. This is how we evolved. And there's a reason that we evolved this way. We should accept who we are and how we are, and we should accept that the way we are is in such a way for a reason. Now, there are other factors to be considered, and I'm not going to get into the other factors that relate to, like if female choosiness was completely unleashed, then all the women would clearly just gravitate to the top tier males, and the top tier males would inseminate all of the women. But there are other things, because a man is not going to be willing, possibly even able, but especially not willing to provide for 100 children. So, a female may also be evaluating, is he going to give me attention, or am I just a fling? She's considering that. But generally speaking, female hypergamy will cause men at the top of the dominance hierarchy to have many children. Many men that have traits that are appealing to women are going to have many children. A lot of men, the lower tiers of men, and even the middle tiers of men, depending on how much the hypergamy is facilitated by society, even the middle tiers of men will be unsuccessful. Like with elephant seals, right? A few powerful elephant seals have all the offspring. Most male elephant seals are unsuccessful. That's hypergamy unleashed. Civilization can't really work that way. There are all kinds of problems that come about when that happens in a civilization, because the question is, are all these lower tier and even middle tier men, are they happy to just work in order to facilitate the pleasures of the top tier men? Are they comfortable with the top tier men having harems of women while they get nothing. They're not going to want to participate in civilization in that kind of a scenario. They'll be more inclined to plot on how to kill their overlords and take their women. That's going to be their number one concern. Because what is the point otherwise? In order for civilization to happen, one-on-one pairings and monogamy need to happen. All the men, not all the men, the vast majority of the men need to be invested in the civilization. They need to be invested in the next generation. They need to not be out for the blood of the leaders. And they'll only stop being out for the blood of the leaders if they're given a woman with whom they can procreate. And that's it. So marriage, monogamy, one man, one woman combination for the creation of families is critical for a functional civilization. Again, a lot of this stuff can be kind of unpopular to say, but that's the way it is. So there's one last thing I want to mention. I didn't read this part early on. It's some of the stuff where he goes into the details about group selection can be a little confusing, but there's really just a few points that he makes about group selection in here that I just want to reiterate, and that is that some of the reasons why group selection doesn't really work. I didn't mention in any of the sections I read, but an important thing is the time frame and the binary quality of individual selection and how powerful it is, right? Generation, like a person can reproduce at, post-puberty. So let's call it 15 years. After 15 years, most people are capable of reproduction. So, you've got a high turnover. Groups can last for a very long time before they're destroyed or go extinct or are assimilated into other groups. So on the individual level, there's constant selection, constant replication. The group just sort of endures, and it's less likely to be destroyed. There are groups that are somewhat cohesive and coherent with an unbroken chain that go back hundreds and thousands of years. Not 15 years, a very long period of time. That's one reason why individual adaptations of individual people are so much more powerful of an evolutionary force than the adaptation and selection of groups. The binary quality of it. Either you replicate or you don't. Either you have children or you don't have children. Simple as that. You have one child or you have two children, which is double the number. 3 children, right? It's cut and dry. You had 5 children. You were very successful, and then you died. Somebody else didn't have any. That's cut and dried. You reproduce or you don't. A group, does a group reproduce? Not really. It endures, but it doesn't reproduce quite like that. It's certainly not a clear binary question because a group can slowly, people can slowly leave the group and join other groups here and there. The group is not perfectly stable over time. You have the same genetic code today as you had when you were born. The group's changing, the gene pool's changing. It's not a clear cut whether it's reproducing. It's not clear cut whether it's surviving, living, or dying. These are the sort of things that make group selection a much weaker force. So while he does, as a section I read to you, he does admit group selection is a real thing, but he says the question really is it having any impact? Is it really doing anything? Can we measure it, and is it measurable? Is it significant, or is it negligible? And he finds that for those reasons I just described, it's really negligible. It's there, but you can always sort of go back to Occam's razor. You can always also generally always also find a scenario where you could say, actually, it looks like group selection. It's not. it's individual selection. If you have to choose between the two, choose individual selection. It makes more sense for it to be located right there for the reasons I described. So that'll do it for this show. Thanks a lot for listening, and I'll talk to you again next time.